This morning we are blessed to have a guest speaker with us. It's going to be Thomas Karst, and I wanted to take a moment to introduce him. Now, you knew you were going to do this, right? As Thomas had mentioned earlier in today's service, he is our former director of religious education. He was actually, I guess, the first hire that happened when I became minister here. And I just wanted to say that for those of you that have been here for the past few years and have seen Thomas's service, you know exactly what he brings to the table. And I just want to say from the bottom of my heart that so much of my own personal ministry, my own theology as a Unitarian Universalist minister, has been immeasurably shaped by my conversations with Thomas. So much of the direction that we have taken over the past few years is absolutely because of the influence that he has had on me as both his minister, his supervisor, but I think most importantly as his friend. Thomas right now, after he left us from being our director of religious education, I guess he's moved on to bigger and better things. He builds furniture, he continues to work in photography. I think he's still working on the stand-up comedy routine. But what I've always felt is that Thomas would actually also make an incredibly valuable Unitarian Universalist theologian if he ever chose to pursue that path professionally. So I'd like to invite all of you to join me in welcoming Thomas to our pulpit.
Morning. This actually might be a little bit scary, but I love that reading. Like, it gets me really excited. So a few weeks ago, Phil suggested in a sermon that the idea of exploring a Unitarian Universalist theology of sin and atonement would be beneficial to Unitarian Universalism. And he just mentioned it briefly. But the idea of a UU theology of sin really piqued my interest. And that's probably because Unitarian Universalist theology is a sprawling web of ideas that can be very hard to make sense of. So much so that even to define what sin means in our theology is difficult, to say the least. One thing that UU theology rejects, though, is the concept of original sin. So it's the idea that we are born with sin, or that sin is somehow a part of what it means to be human. And Unitarian and Universalist theologies, before those were two separate theologies, right? And both of those theologies rejected this concept of original sin before the theologies came together and we had Unitarian Universalism. My point is that a sermon arguing for the idea of original sin in a Unitarian Universalist context would be pretty heretical for us. And if you hear a UU sermon arguing for the idea of original sin, you should immediately reject it out of hand. It's probably not a good thing. So this morning, I'm here to argue for the idea of original sin in a Unitarian Universalist context. That's right. I think we are all born with an original sin that is intrinsic to what it means to be human. Now, that idea might trigger some of us. And I know this is a UU church. You probably didn't come here this morning to hear that we're all sinners, right? But let me say up front that I don't think sin is a problem at all. And in all actuality, I'm playing with the term original sin because that term in particular has caused some real pain in real people's lives. And I know that I have personally experienced some trauma from this term, original sin. So here's what I hope happens this morning. I hope we can take an idea that has caused pain and use it to light up some new acceptance of ourselves instead. All right? Are you with me for the next 15 minutes? So, traditionally, we find the idea of original sin in Christian theology. And the traditional notion is that sin is a separation from God, and original sin is just the idea that humans are separated from this God at birth. So that's the traditional idea that we're starting with. Let's see if we can turn it on its head a little bit this morning. Let's start by redefining some of the terms. So first, the idea that sin is a separation. Here, I would actually argue that the traditional view doesn't go far enough. Because we aren't just separated from the divine or God or the transcendent or the universe or whatever language you want to use there. It's bigger than that. Because to be human, to have self-awareness, means you see yourself as something other than everything else. So there's two components to that idea that imply separation. First, you are separate from everything. So you are separate from the chair you're sitting in. I am separate from the lectern that I'm standing behind. I'm not just separated from a God. I'm separated from everything just so I can differentiate myself. Secondly, that you see yourself means that you are other than and separate from your own self. Because you can stand back in your mind and say, oh, I'm a thing. And that second component there begs the question that if we are to know ourselves, who is knowing and whom is being known? We don't know. We can't know ourselves. And we've had that separation ever since we can remember being. It is an original lack or separation, an original sin, if you will. Now, another term in that traditional notion of original sin that we can play with is God. And here's how I define God. In a very broad philosophical sense, a God is this. A God is something that offers wholeness, completion, and satisfaction. A God is something that proposes to bridge the separation within each of us. And I would argue that the idea of a God is alive and well today, mainly in secular culture. Now, I say this because we're offered wholeness, completion, and satisfaction on every corner. Let me ask you this: who is planning on visiting the new IKEA that's opening up at the town center, right? Has anyone been on Tinder lately? Have you checked Facebook? Have you tried ayahuasca? Have you attended a church service lately? Did you show up here this morning with the hope that you would be made whole and complete or satisfied in some way? There are millions of gods offering wholeness, completion, and satisfaction. So we have this separation that's intrinsic to our humanity, and we're constantly trying to find a God to bridge that gap to make us whole and complete. But here's the thing. None of those gods will ever bridge that gap. We'll always be separated from ourselves. Now, that might sound bad. I might have made it worse, right? We all have this embedded separation, and nothing we can do can fix it. It does sound bad. But what if actually, we actually don't need to fix it? What if the purpose of any good theology is to discover what it means to be human? What if our spiritual practices are finding out what it's like to be more fully human? And what if social justice is about fighting those things that are inhumane? In that case, this is good news. It's good news because rather than filling our lives with a pursuit of what will bridge the gap of that original sin, we can instead embrace our separation with the glint of exploration in our eyes. So it means that our theologies and spiritual practices are not about trying to attain enlightenment or become whole and complete. They are about accepting ourselves and looking at ourselves more honestly. It means that the first step in social justice is less about figuring out a way to try and not be racist or misogynistic or homophobic. And it's more about figuring out why we feel any of those modes of existing would make us or the people around us more whole and complete in the first place. Because they won't. Nothing will. But seeing ourselves more honestly for the separated beings that we are is actually where real change can happen. And usually when we take an honest look at ourselves, we think we see problems. We think we see a lot of problems. But typically the thing that we see is not a problem. Typically the things that seem like problems aren't problems at all. They're solutions to problems. So alcoholism, racism, homophobia, suicide, homicide, war, these aren't problems. These are solutions to problems. These are symptoms of a much deeper problem. Symptoms are our way of trying to fill the gap of that separation that we feel embedded in us. We oppress, eradicate, or otherwise drown out the thing that reminds us of that separation. We try to cover over the problem. So let's say, for example, I'm seeing some addictive traits when I drink. Typically, we try to silence the symptom. I typically try to figure out how to stop drinking, right? But if I stop drinking alcohol without confronting why I needed to obsess over drinking in the first place, it'll only change forms. And most likely I'll take up some other much worse addiction, like CrossFit or something like that. But if instead of trying to fix that symptom, if I let my symptom speak to me, it becomes a light into myself. So I might find that I'm drinking to avoid the loneliness of a divorce. And that problem is uncovered. The French psychoanalyst Lacan talks about symptoms. And he says a symptom, and he uses an archaic spelling. It's Sinthome. It's pronounced Santom, right? And it sounds like the French word for holy man or prophet. So Lacan says if you listen to your symptom, it can become a prophet. It will tell you the truth in yourself you don't want to face. So that means the deeper problem is uncovered. And now you can accept that you're accepted. That is grace. When we accept that we're accepted, we are more able to move past being whole and complete and see that we are beautiful, complex, and constantly changing pieces of a whole and complete universe that we're embedded in. And oddly, when we do this, real change happens in our lives and in the lives of those around us. Blessing.